Does he still?
It'll
Okay.
help.
All right, here I am. I'm gonna get in a good pose here, so I look very good and professional. Our speaker tonight is Beth Buelow. And unfortunately, she had a family emergency and had to cancel. So, because we've got good technology, and because we've got Zoom, and also we've got Jan Lewis, we put this thing together and we're doing it by Zoom. She's a dynamic award-winning artist, coach, and educator, and she lives in Muskegon. Many of us who heard about her were very anxious to see her in purpose, but unfortunately, it didn't work out. Best photography, it really doesn't fit in with any particular thing to give it a title. Her specialty is abstract and minimalist photography. And her program tonight is titled Creating Personally Iconic Imagery and Epic Locations Not Required. So Beth, I'd like to welcome you to the Grand Rapids Camera Club. Welcome.
Thank you. And can somebody give me a quick confirmation you can hear me okay?
Wait a minute, we gotta get the sound working again.
Okay, okay. Okay. Do you want me to, can you hear me now?
I'll let you know in just a minute.
Okay.
Yeah, lights down, please.
Where's output?
Yeah, we had it set, but
Oh, scroll up to let me see more tracks. That was.
Yeah.
I'm not sure there's not there. Anyway, that's and then I'll check it over.
okay. You wanna try?
Do you want me to say
Let's try
something
a
to see
test,
if
see
it,
if we can hear you.
okay. All right, can you hear me? We're gonna talk about, nope,
That's the
okay.
microphone so that it can hear us.
Oh, okay.
But we need to change to what? Okay.
Is the thing still plugged in?
I just have to go.
Don't trip.
Yeah, don't trip.
So it's in the back section. We need to text guy.
You have to look at something on the screen.
Sure.
It was work. You haven't worked.
Okay,
No.
all right.
You think it's, I hear some echo, so I'm thinking it's probably working. Can you give me a thumbs up that you can hear me okay? Yay. So Jan, I don't know which computer it would be, but I would love to see as many faces in the room if they would lean in and wave so that I can at least see some faces. So if you turn it around and they turn around, then at least I can see a few people. There we go. Awesome. Hi. Yeah, hi, West Michigan friends. You know, sometimes I am asked if I get nervous before presentations, and I've been doing it long enough that I really don't get nervous at all. But this is, I think, the first time I felt sad because I'm not there with you. And I'm very appreciative to Jan and your leadership accommodating me. I'm coming to you from a hotel room in Bowling Green, Kentucky, which is actually where I grew up. And I have aging parents and a very sick father right now in the hospital. And so there are some difficult conversations going on this week. And I'm sure many of you have had those kinds of conversations before. So I'm appreciative of being able to still come to you and share with you tonight. I want to start out with Mary Oliver. a poet that some of you might be familiar with. She is a poet for nature lovers who delight in reflecting on the extraordinary in the ordinary. And she writes, I do not live happily or comfortably with the cleverness of our times. The talk is all about computers. The news is all about bombs. And this morning, in a fresh field, I came upon a hidden nest. It held 4 warm, speckled eggs. I touched them, then I went softly away, having felt something more wonderful than all the electricity in New York City. This poem perfectly encapsulates the mindset that I'm inviting us to dive into over the next hour. As photographers, we spend a lot of time and energy and money pursuing the equivalent, like the nature and wildlife and landscape equivalent to all of the electricity in New York City. And our focus tonight is going to be more on those warm speckled eggs that have just as much meaning and power. As I share this more philosophical side of this activity, love, it might seem like I'm going to be adding a layer of complexity to something that really might seem quite simple. We spend so much of our photography learning focused on the more technical aspects of learning our gear and processing and composition and techniques. For our time together, I'm going to ask that you join me in exploring our relationship to photography and what we're drawn to photograph. And again, this is not so we can overthink it or suck the fun out of it. And not because everything needs to have some sort of profound hidden meaning. It's more about adding some intentionality to our creativity, about having another tool that we can draw on, especially if we're feeling creatively blocked. And it helps us to facilitate thinking about different ways that our images tell a story. And I believe this storytelling is what will keep photography as an art form. You've probably had conversations amongst yourselves and maybe with others about the impact of AI. And I think this storytelling is part of what will keep AI from pushing us out and making us irrelevant. We can't take our relevance for granted. So it's important that we consider these different points of human connection. And whether we're hobbyists, professionals, or somewhere in between, we all take photographs because we want to communicate and we want to add meaning and beauty to the world. And that's what I'm going to ask you to consider as I share these thoughts and these images tonight. And these 2 images are ones I took with my iPhone. There's a bush outside my husband's office in downtown Muskegon, and often in the spring there are little birds. And I came upon the eggs, and then a week or so later came upon the little the baby birds. And so that's something that's meaningful to me. So this train of thought about being personally iconic started during a conversation that I had on my podcast with landscape photographer Joshua Cripps. We were talking about iconic photography landscapes and how it's great to try for those kinds of locations, but it's just as, if not more meaningful sometimes to create images that are iconic for us. And I'd not thought of it in those terms before that conversation. So when the words iconic for us came out of my mouth, I wondered, what the heck do I mean by that? It made sense to me on an intuitive level because it just sort of bubbled up. But I knew I was going to have to dig a little bit to see what was underneath that. And that's kind of what we're going to be doing tonight. Explore here, an icon represents something perceived as excellent or noteworthy. And considering what iconic for us means, I think about what criteria we use to determine what is excellent, what is generally perceived as noteworthy. Is it out there, out in the world, or is it somewhere in here within us? Or maybe it's both. And so, not to give away the ending here, but here's a place that we're headed. we're going to be looking at, and I'm inviting you into this opportunity to shift our mindset from iconic being something out there to being an attitude that comes from a personal place, tapping into our personal wisdom and the collective wisdom that everyone carries with them, whether they're aware of it or not. We're going to consider this new way of seeing our photography that in reality is a very familiar way that we see the world. And so I want to warm up to this idea by considering 8 of my images that I pulled and what they potentially symbolize. For each one of them, I'm going to pause for maybe 10 seconds or so and ask you to turn to the person sitting next to you. So kind of find a partner. And I just want you to share in just a few words what the image represents to you. And don't overthink it, but just what's the first idea that comes to mind? This is not a test, but it's rather this chance to kind of go beyond a little bit of the obvious of what the image portrays and into maybe a layer or two underneath. I want to know what you see. So, like I said, I'll pause for roughly 10 seconds before moving on to the next one and just talk with your partner about what does the image symbolize or reflect to you? So here's the first one. Okay. I hope you had maybe some interesting or conversations. I would actually love to hear a little bit about what you all shared, but I notice whenever it's unmuted, there's a huge echo. So I'm just going to trust that you had some good chat. So thank you for adopting that exercise to this particular hybrid situation, and thanks for sharing your thoughts with one another. I hope this warmed up your brain to the topic of asking deeper questions about what makes a location, a subject, or a person iconic. Because while there wasn't a single recognizably iconic scene in any of those, that group of 8 images, what my objective here is to show how they can still be personally iconic when considered through a particular lens. And this is a question: what makes a location, subject, or person iconic? I use to guide everything that I'm going to share here. So as we dive into that, it's a natural thing to maybe just like, let's define the word iconic or icon. And here's what Merriam-Webster has to say. It's a person or thing widely admired, especially for having great influence or significance in a particular sphere. It's an emblem or a symbol. It's a graphic display on our computer screens, like, the little floppy disk for saving a file. It's a sign, such as a graphic symbol or a word whose form suggests its meaning. And then archaic, which we don't often think about, maybe perhaps in religious contexts, it's usually a pictorial representation or an image. And so if you think of certain landscapes as a thing that is widely admired or especially having great influence, these are some of the destinations that, and I'm sure there are many others that might come to mind when you're browsing on Instagram or Facebook or looking at somebody's portfolio. You're going to see things from these amazing places like Patagonia and Scotland and New Zealand and Death Valley. And there's an undeniable pull that we feel towards these amazing and breathtaking landscapes and ecosystems. And I want to emphasize that my intention with this presentation is to offer a yes and. Yes to possibly exploring the natural world in an epic way, seeking out epic locations and photographing those icons. And if you want a new creative challenge and to invite some surprises into your adventure, you have this opportunity to slow down, to look past the obvious scenes and landmarks and the easily recognizable, deeper into the messages from the landscape that might resonate on a deeper level. And I want to offer one example of where this has played out for me. So a few years ago, my decision to attend a workshop in Death Valley back in 2023 was in part driven by FOMO, which you probably know as fear of missing out. I'd never even considered Death Valley as a location until I heard Sarah Marino, and some of you might be familiar with her work. I just adore her. She was talking about her work, and she talked about it such that it's like, I have to go there. I just couldn't wait. And so I saw the amazing images that others were taking there, and I had this fear of missing out on getting those kinds of fantastic scenes. So when I finally was there for this workshop, I did take some images that I see as more traditional or and I don't mean that in a negative way, just in the sense that they weren't especially unique. And I would probably put that black and white one there on the side as an example of that, because in fact, one of the instructors took almost this exact image that I saw months later posted on Instagram. So that tells me that, yeah, it's a good point of view, but it's not particularly unique. And then I also made images that I'd come to realize were more unusual. And I love both of the traditional and the unusual kinds of images equally. And so I made a second trip in February of 2024, and it was just a very brief one. And I only had about 24 hours in the park. And if you've ever been to Death Valley, I think it is literally like, millions of acres, thousands of miles. I probably spent an entirety of 8 hours photographing in the park, and I didn't go to a single sand dune. Part of that was the weather, and I wasn't quite prepared, but it was also somewhat intentional. I had a feeling of actual peace when I realized that I would not get any iconic dune images, because then that meant I could focus on getting some other surprises. And if you saw in the news, it was popped up quite a bit that there was a lake in Death Valley in February of 2024. It's called Manly Lake, and it pops up very rarely. But it was there, and maybe I was just in the wrong spot, or the water had dropped significantly, or there were some strong winds that might have blown it. I did not see what I was hoping or expecting to see. And by releasing some FOMO and those expectations that of amazing, iconic lake in Death Valley shot, I just tried to enjoy what I did see and focused on that. And so this mindset helped me to release that disappointment or any frustration that reality didn't match my expectations. And it made me flexible enough to take the time to seek out and be open to places and scenes that transcend the need to have
Hold on,
a
we
famous
lost the
location.
volume.
Uh-oh. Okay. Tell me when you're ready.
Try again.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. All right. Good. I'm not sure where it cut out, but I was just saying, this mindset really helped me to release some disappointment and frustration when reality didn't match my expectations. And me use the time in the park in a different way that I would have otherwise. And so these are the images that I captured on that trip. And you might look at them and guess where they're taken. But I think that most folks, even those that have been to Death Valley, might not necessarily assume that that's where I took them. And so for me, that means that when you look at these, instead of thinking Death Valley and every other image of that location that you've seen before, you're not thinking of Death Valley. You're not thinking about the location. You're thinking about the image. You're not thinking about what we normally associate with that place, but just the image itself and what it says to you. And that's the gift, that removal of the narrative, a well-known and iconic subject will bring. It allows you to bring the space to consider. And you can take iconic images at popular locations, but I think of it as like instead of by zigging instead of zagging, even just a little bit, you're going to make images and art that only you can make and tell a story only you can tell, because no one else sees the world through your heart and your eyes and your experience. And these locations have come to symbolize not just the landscapes they contain, but also our ego. And this is one of these points that I debate whether or not to leave it in, but I do think that it's something for us to consider. And when I talk about ego, I'm not talking about it in necessarily a negative way. It occurs to me that this is just true for me, and so I'm venturing to guess perhaps this will resonate with some of you. So our ego is not a bad thing. It's what gets us moving, believing in our ability to create images and to share those images, and that we are worthy of these kinds of epic experiences. There's also something to the idea that if you are photographing in these places, you have some resources. You have resources of time and money and physical capacity to travel and hike and navigate these places that aren't accessible to many people, at least not in the way that photographers often have. One of the reasons this topic is, I think, particularly important now is that these places, these iconic places, and even places that you might consider like B or C list locations, they're increasingly overrun with tourists and influencers and people that want to sort of cash in on those tourists and influencers. And the very things that drew us as photographers to that scene are being, and in some cases, access has been limited or maybe even completely denied, so that the landmarks and the habitats and the environment can be kept from being destroyed. So, there is absolutely something to having our own images of these icons that represent our skill and our spirit as a photographer. It almost doesn't matter sometimes if we are taking that same image that others have taken 1,000 times before. What matters is that we took it and we have an emotional connection to it, and we don't really care if it's a copycat of a copycat of a copycat. We got to experience the environment. We got to stand on the edge. We got to feel the wind. We got to see the bird. We got to experience, getting caught in the rain, whatever it might be. We got that kind of thrill, and that's the gift of being in an amazing place with our. So while it can be difficult to completely release FOMO, we could try replacing it with something else. And that's JOMO, or the joy of missing out. And there's a lot of freedom in JOMO. You place a priority on valuing your experiences that you have for yourself, and you're not concerned with what others are doing or creating. And you're creating what most aligns with you and who you are. And you're stepping off the comparison path, and you're using the space to find your own way. And so JOMO is really about releasing pressure, giving ourselves permission to photograph anywhere we are and to feel proud of those results, and let go of the belief that whatever we were photographing had to be something important, or we had to be someplace amazing. And you might have heard the expression, wherever you go, there you are. You carry your vision with you, whether you're in downtown Grand Rapids, whether you're in your backyard, or maybe you're on one of the photographic shorelines that we're so lucky to have in Michigan. It doesn't matter if you're focused in on, like I'm going to talk about a little bit later, a plant that you find in an alley, or that grand landscape. So how do we reframe iconic if we're coming from this joy of missing out mindset? And I took the liberty of defining iconic based on the idea that an icon represents something that has universal appeal or is widely recognizable. So generally perceived and revered as representative of an idea, a value, and or an archetype, which I'll talk about a little bit in a few minutes, that resonates on a conscious and a subconscious level. In nature photography, particularly, there are certain landscapes and iconic besides those locations that I mentioned. And we can start to fall into believing that they're only these things, the mountains, the plants, the animals, the forests, that they're only iconic if we're in a location that has been deemed iconic by the photography-osphere. And so what we're going to be looking at is how could these subjects transcend that location and have a naturally powerful story to tell. And these landscapes are in part iconic because they represent some of the traits that you see here on the right, and they're not aligned. So volcanoes do not represent innocence, but all of these things in different incarnations represent these other things of power, exploration, the masculine and the feminine, and our shadow. And so reflecting on this idea led me to and the concept of archetypes. And the people and places that we tend to revere often can be tied to an archetypal figure. And so I'm going to go down that path for just a couple minutes and then talk about how it applies to making personally meaningful and iconic images. And so you might be aware there are 4 main archetypes. We have our persona, which is kind of our mask that we present to the world. Our shadow holds our consciously unknown traumas and gifts. The anima and the animus reflect our masculine and feminine energies. And our self archetype is a unification of all these different parts. And so these archetypes are in relationship with one another and come together in different ways to form what you see here in archetypal figures. And if you think about just about any narrative arc, any story, it will have some or all of these archetypes represented. One to use as an example is the original Star Wars, which in my mind is really the only Star Wars. We have our hero in Luke Skywalker. We have the sage of Obi-Wan Kenobi, the wizard in Yoda, Darth Vader as the shadowy ruler, Han Solo as an explorer, and the Rebel Alliance as obviously the rebels, C-3PO and R2-D2 as the jesters, and Princess Leia as the innocent, the rebel, and the caregiver. And combination of these characters and these energies, really, they appear in just about every story ever told. And so when we reflect on these patterns that are part of the collective unconscious, we are connecting to an iconic energy that resonates beyond what we can often put into words. And it's easy to make these associations when we're talking about people. But when we're applying this concept to nature and other types of non photography, there's a bit of anthropomorphizing that we do. Um, and that's okay because it helps us to tell that story. And these are energies that we project into our environment, whether we're conscious of it or not. And so, personally iconic, how can we move from that external iconic to personally iconic? And again, I made up my own definition so that it supports my hypothesis, I will fully admit. But basically, personally iconic boils down to images infused with personal meaning and or perspective, whether they are of universally recognized or everyday overlooked objects. The creation of personally iconic images calls us to push past the obvious and consider the essence of what we're seeing and what in that essence resonates with us on a deeper level. So I'm going to share a series of small scenes. And now that we've kind of gotten into a little bit more detail about the representation and the symbolism, um, I want to share these in that spirit and maybe talk just mention kind of what I see in them, and I hope you'll think about what you see. Um, these small scenes, they don't include objectively epic or iconic scenes. They're absent any recognizable landmark, but I hope what you see is a universality to them and that they represent some of these more universal themes and patterns that we find in the archetypes. So as I share them, I'm not going to tell you where I took them, as I want them to be location agnostic. A few were actually taken in locations that particularly nature photographers would describe as iconic or epic, or at least at the very least, a destination that they would probably go out of their way to visit. Again, by not sharing specifics, this is an opportunity to consider them for what they communicate rather than where they're located. So here we have, two trees. I wish I were in the room for you because I would just ask you what you see. But I will tell you, what resonates with me is connection, rootedness, life cycles, resilience, and maybe even a hero as being the caregiver for all the birds and animals and insects that a tree provides protection and even maybe food and some sort of sustenance to those creatures. Some of you might recognize not the image on the left, but the sculpture on the left. I believe it's called him, her, or she, he, at Meyer Gardens, which I go to frequently to see what I can find, see what I can see anew. But to me, these images represent femininity and mystery and maybe even intimacy. This one, on the other hand, represents more strength and maybe masculinity, resilience. The plant is scarred, but yet it's really thriving, and it's a beautiful cactus. And then we have water. I don't know about you, but I never tire of taking pictures of water, and the reflections and the movement and the different moods that it has. And these represent that universality of water as an icon, regardless of where it is. It symbolizes life, sustenance, it's cleansing, calm, it is reflective, and it's ever changing. You never will go back to water and have it be the same scene twice. And I think that's one reason why many of us just go back to it again and again and again. This nautilus shell and spiral patterns tell a story of life cycles, of growth and evolution. Here we see a shoreline at Pere Marquette Beach that this was earlier this spring, and I went down to the shoreline, and I was just I probably let out a little yip of excitement when I saw all of these curves. And so both of these images, they to me, they say they have a story sort of power, like particularly the power of water to disrupt, and how water is shaped and how things yield and are shaped and sometimes become more beautiful than they were had they not had that disruption. And then in these, I see balance. I see dichotomy. I see opposites, yin yang. There's a word, syzygy. I always want to put an R in it, syzygy, which is part of that masculine and feminine. And it basically means you have a balance of both. So I think of syzygy when I see these. And then this to me represents magic and mystery and the unknown. And you can as there's always this question of, how much do I tell? How much do I share about this image to let people know, context, what I see in it and they see in it. And I think that's a really personal decision that we make with our images, how we want to present them. And part of what I hope you're taking away from this is there are opportunities to tell these stories, maybe through the titles or the caption that you can just offer, like I might call this one mystery or magic. And it plants a seed of maybe what I'm hoping to communicate without necessarily telling them what they should see. And maybe it opens up something for them that they wouldn't have seen otherwise. I want to spend a couple minutes taking a look at a few illustrations of personally iconic images coming from both iconic and non-iconic locations. And this first one is from Rocky Mountain National Park. I went there for the very first time this past February at a women's photography conference. And it was interesting, very much, as you've seen with some of these images, focused in on small scenes. And by small scenes, I mean, like you're filling the frame, it's close up, it may or may not be macro, but you're pulling something out of its context of the larger environment and just focusing in. And when I found myself standing there on a lake, a frozen lake, in Rocky Mountain National Park, how could I not take some photos of these mountains, of these beautiful evergreens, of the snow and the clouds? It seems like it would be like almost dishonoring if I did not take some photos of that grand landscape. And I captured them less because I wanted to have maybe great images of the mountains, and more almost because I felt like I sort of had to, like, you're here and this is what you do. I took this one and then I took this one. I think this one's in a different location. I was standing in a parking lot. I mean, that's the way Rocky, Colorado and whatnot are. You could just be in the parking lot of the grocery store and look out and see this amazing landscape. But instead of really focusing on trying to get great images that I loved of that, I was drawn to small scenes. When we're looking for personally resonant images that go beyond ourselves, we can try combining them, telling this story of a place or a time. And these images might not stand well alone as individual photos, but I think when they are paired together, they tell the story of a place. And they give you something about what makes that place iconic: the textures, the life, the diversity, the muted winter landscape. And so, yes, I was in Rocky Mountain National Park. And that mountains had been photographed a million times. I snapped the shutter a few times so I could feel that connection to them. Um, but I personally didn't feel, like I said, towards getting my own mountain images. I wanted these smaller, quieter scenes that told another piece of the landscape story. And these scenes are also a little bit broader in scope, but I still think they qualify as sort of intimate landscapes. And you can see some mystery and resilience and exploration in these images. The second illustration is another iconic location of Olympic National Park. And I lived out in Tacoma, Washington for 10 years before we moved back to Michigan, to Muskegon. Yet I think I only went on the edges of Olympic National Park like once in that 10 years. Up to get me to go back last summer in 2024. And this is one of those iconic scenes that you think of with Olympic National Park or even the Pacific Northwest, these moss covered trees. And what I found, and I don't know if you've ever experienced this, I was drowning in green. I was having a really hard time seeing things. If you've done any woodland photography, you know that it can be chaotic. It can be very challenging. You think, oh, it's just trees; they don't go anywhere, so easy peasy. Um, but I found myself really, really challenged by them. So instead, I focused on water and small scenes. And even as that water flowed gently, the constantly moving and sometimes rushing river to me told this story of power. And that's what you see there. And then on the right, as it sparkled with the afternoon sun, I felt like I was seeing this reflection of the entire universe as it broke around rocks and picked up sunlight that then kind of turned into stars. And these images show the water in even more different moods, from this dark and mysterious to more playfully bright and cheerful. And so each of these images communicates a different story. And yes, I took them in an iconic location, but it's not the location that to me makes them personally iconic. It's more the meaning that I ascribe to them and the story that they tell. And when I was ready to turn my attention back to the plants, then I was drawn to things that told some sort of story of renewal or calm or interconnectedness or quiet. And here I was playing with the landscape to capture magic and that spirit of exploration that I could feel in the park. A sort of, you're in a bubble and there's a sort of otherworldliness to it. So the third and final personally iconic location illustration is my neighborhood in downtown Muskegon. I don't know how many of you are familiar with downtown Muskegon. Maybe some of you have lived there. I live on Jefferson Street, just a block and a half from Muskegon High School. And so we have a lot of beautiful Victorian homes, turn of the century homes, and it's a beautiful place to be. And so I try to make a sort of seasonally do the rounds through the neighborhood, through the alley, down the streets. And on the surface, because you're often just driving down the street, you don't notice things. When you get out on foot, that's when you really see beyond just what you see as you're driving by, whizzing by in your car. And so these are from a walk I took this spring. And what got me out the door was the flowers and the colors, because we get really excited, right, when we start to see those buds. What I noticed as I kept photographing were the metaphors and the symbolism that really was everywhere I looked. Here we see growth, renewal, all the things we associate with spring. We also saw, and this kind of surprised me a little bit, this growing, this aging and dying, all those things all at the same time. Like in that upper left, you can see fresh spring leaves in the back, yet we also see the base of the flower left over from the winter that's still holding on. And so we're seeing all the time this sort of cycle of life. And then here, point some evergreens and some tree trunk roots that were exposed on the ground. I feel like we see wisdom. We see the sage. We see renewal and caring. The way that, especially that um, one of, at the end, I don't think I'd ever really looked at an evergreen tree to see what I know is going to become a pine cone. um, and so capturing something that represents creation. And then I mentioned my alley. This is the alley. I visit this alley, on a fairly regular basis. And it's so easy to pass by. It just looks like it's full of weeds and, just a tangled mess. But when you really slow down, it is full of stories. And so these are two that I took. The one on the left I took, I believe, last fall. The one on the right I just took like last week. Um, some magic and some fantasy and maybe a little bit of innocence. Here, these leaves are showing the passage of time and themes of diversity and evolution. And so it was considering these themes of life and death and growth and innocence and magic that I found images that spoke to me, even in the alleyway. And so the goal of all of this isn't necessarily to create images that will win competitions. They might not score very highly in a camera club contest. And they're not necessarily maybe going to be added to your portfolio or to a website, although some of them might. And some of mine, I have gone ahead and done that. The outcome is really that new way of seeing. So I want to close with, kind of bringing home a few points about how we can think in terms of personally iconic images. And at the start, my intention isn't necessarily to suggest that every image that you take has to have this deep meaning. Some are just fun. They're just beautiful. It's just about the moment. Oftentimes it's more about the experience of photographing than it is about the photograph itself. So I offer these ideas in the spirit of giving you just another way to consider your images and to use, especially if you're feeling like your creative well is dry. So the first one, and this comes as no surprise, release the assumption that you must be somewhere epic. And the feedback I've gotten when I share this with other groups, they're like, oh, I don't have any excuses. I don't have to travel. You're telling me I don't have to travel. I don't have to be someplace unusual or exotic to take interesting images. It can be easy for us to fall in that trap. Well, I'm just home and there's nothing here. Travel and the are amazing, and this is not to deny that. It's just that acknowledging the reality that, I don't know about you, but I don't have, that bottomless bank account or, an empty calendar full of time to where I could be constantly traveling and going to these places. So if we want to be photographing on a regular basis, we are, there's an opportunity to accept and make the most of wherever we find ourselves. Suspend judgment of what you're drawn to. I sometimes find myself self-censoring what I point my camera at, thinking it's too mundane or it's too unsophisticated. And that's my own story that I've, have been continuing to grapple with. And excuse me, I need. And so I'm guessing I'm not alone in looking at what I'm drawn to, making the leap in that self-censoring and thinking, well, people will think this is unimpressive. It's kind of dumb. It's juvenile. It's mundane, it's boring. I'm just going to skip it. Or maybe I'll take the photo and not share it. And I've gotten through that story in some ways by the mundane and unsophisticated, or adding that to my bag of tricks. For example, and this is especially good in the winter time, depending on if you like winter or not, I try to find ways to do things at home. And so I have more images than are probably healthy of my dog's slow feeder bowl, a slinky, plastic utensils, leaks, oil and water, brightly colored plastic measuring cups. Those are just a few of the examples. But still, I judge myself, even though I really have fun taking the results, because none of those images are iconic. maybe except for the slinky. These images, as I say here, they're from the Amtrak window. I was taking the Amtrak from, I think I usually catch it in Holland, and just passing the time on a trip where I was coming back from Chicago. And I noticed all these power lines. And in this case, the story was really clear to me in the moment. In this wireless world, look at how much wires dominate our landscape. And they're so ubiquitous that we really stop seeing them after a while. Well, I found these images, and that story kind of intriguing. I also noticed myself judging them as boring and unremarkable. And so letting go of that judgment allows me to see them as representing perhaps the everyman archetype figure, in that they're humble, they're hardworking, they're unassuming and simple, and yet they form a really important role, and they do their work quietly, but we hope reliably. And so maybe that's a stretch. You might be saying, oh, you're kind of getting a lot out of those, pretty basic images. And maybe, but by considering these images through that lens, I'm exploring, and I'm inviting you to explore other possibilities that might build on that theme. And maybe I end up doing a series of power lines, and it's much more intentional in trying to tell that story. So I might open up creative exploration and experimentation. Suspending judgment, what you're drawn to. This was the first thing I saw when I got out of my car at a parking garage on a college campus at Northwestern. And for a moment, I had the thought, okay, you're in a parking garage and you think that's worth getting your camera out, because I hadn't gotten it out yet. And I thought, yeah, it is. I'll be thinking about after I've left this garage. And so, yeah, I'm going to take out my camera. And part of it like gives me this sense of calm. It's my beloved Lake Michigan, that we see through there. I was appreciating the contrast, the colors, the lines. Something about it felt sort of like Miami, and that Art Deco, turn of the century, kind of, or not turn of the century, but I'm blanking on the sort of 50s aesthetic. Mid-century, that's it, mid-century, that's what I wanted. Honor the gravitational pull of the object you're seeing. So work your subject. This was taken in Chicago Botanic Garden. And in this case, I was really smitten with this eucalyptus plant, but I struggled to get an image that I really liked. And there was another photographer in the garden, a professional, and I'm going to move on. I really wanted to get something, but I'm not doing it. And she said, okay, you can move on, but you have to get something you like first. You need to take at least 20 pictures of that eucalyptus. And if you still don't get something you like, you can go, but you need to do that. And so I kept going, and I finally got this result that really made me happy. And without knowing more about the plant, there was something in it that made me want to keep going. And when I researched the symbolism, what I found was that the eucalyptus is a holy tree for the Aboriginals. For them, it represents, and you can see it, the division of underworld, earth, and heaven. And it also has a purifying effect, as negative energy disappears in the place where you burn a eucalyptus leaf. And so I didn't know that story. I didn't know that symbolism in the field, but knowing it now makes this image even more important to me. And to follow that, no disclaimers just because the object or the scene is ordinary. We don't have to defend or explain ourselves. I don't have to justify why I decided to take an image of something ordinary. I don't have to say, I went to Chicago Botanic Garden and all I got was this stupid leaf. This is actually one of my favorite images from the days at the garden a few years ago, and it was captured in the parking lot walking back to my car. And the truth is that backstory is neither here nor there. It's not, but it's also, something I don't have to explain. I can just let the image speak for itself. And the images over there on the left were taken just this in March at Pure Marquette Beach. And I don't have to necessarily, I just want to let those images do their work on whoever is looking at them. This image is a little bit different because it's more street photography, but to me, it's about trusting the meaning or the story image. this particular photo represents to me awe and wonder, the innocent and the explorer. It's in Chicago, but it could be really any big city. Had just put away my camera when I saw this group of travelers. And so I had my iPhone handy and just quick snapped a few photos. And I knew this ordinary scene had layers of meaning, and it struck a chord with me really in a very personal way. And I didn't know exactly what I was capturing at first, but its meaning has deepened for me over time. And even though I took this back in 2022, and I feel like I've taken, better images and maybe more, intentional images, this one still remains one of my favorite ever. And I think it's because of what it captures in that innocence and awe at something bigger. And then finally, to review your work and consider patterns or themes or energies and stories and narratives that create a theme or emerge as dominant, because this shows you what you're naturally drawn to and what resonates with you on a level that you might not be aware of, at least not at the time. And it can reveal those threads across space and time that might surprise you, because what resonates with you has meaning, and what has meaning is personal. And when I go through mine, the top row is obvious there. And I did not take any of these with a conscious decision. Oh, I want to create light and shadow and contrast and opposing energies. Um, they just happened. And so when I'm looking through my catalog and I'm like, look at that. This is a theme that keeps showing up. And even those ones on the bottom are still continuing that theme of contrast, of gradients of these being represented next to each other. So before we wrap things up and I offer you a few parting questions for reflection, I wanted to share just a couple of ways and opportunities that you can connect with me. So feel free to visit my website. This QR code takes you to the page where I publish a newsletter and you can sign up for it. I've just kind of got that kicked off. I think I've done like 5 issues so far. I call them Friday Photo Thoughts, and I do it every other Friday. And I try to offer some food for thought and maybe a photographic challenge for you. And I also share just some resources and things that I think are valuable for all of us. Also have a presence on YouTube. You can go to Pixels, Heart, and Art, and there you'll see with some of my favorite photographers and photographers that related to me. And as of May, I have shifted and am publishing Pixels at the Nature Photography Collective. You can find me at Beth Buelow Photo on Instagram, and I'm really excited to be speaking at a photography conference. It's called the Horizons Photography Conference in Durango, Colorado. It's coming up right around the corner, but there are still tickets available. So if you're like, wanting an adventure at the last minute and you're looking for some fabulous fall color, maybe consider joining us. And you can learn more at horizonsphoto.com. Something I hope that all of you are maybe interested in. If you look at workshops at all, you see that they are almost never in the Midwest. So I'm pairing up with Stephanie Johnson. She is an Iowa-based photographer. She specializes in abstract and ice camera movement, and she's a great colleague, and we're going to be putting on a Heartland photography retreat / workshop. The location is still to be determined. I think it's going to be in Michigan, so fingers crossed. And if you want to sign up just to be notified of when that is announced, you can email joy@naturephotocollective.com and just say, hey, add me to the Midwest or Heartland photography retreat announcement list. It won't sign you up for everything. You'll just get that notification. So some parting questions for you. These are some reflection questions I invite you to consider that I hope will bring you closer to seeing the personally iconic nature of your own work. So to think about, what is iconic to you? What is symbolic and meaningful and essential to you? How does that way you see personally iconic, how does that show up in your work? And then what would it mean for you to create more of those personally iconic images? What would you need to start doing, stop doing, or keep doing or being in order to do those? You know, what would you need to open yourself up to? What maybe would you need to let go of? So that's the coach in me, asking those questions to just invite some deeper reflection. So I'm curious, questions, comments, snide remarks. The snide remarks comes from my 7th grade social studies teacher, Mr. Holt, who would always end class this way. So somehow I felt like channeling him because it always made us giggle. So I'm not sure how this will work in terms of like, I'm hoping there's not echo, and maybe you want to just check in and unmute once you have a question or a comment, and we can handle it that way. But I'll leave that to you to
well, I have I'm unmuted. Getting a lot of echo.
yeah.
Can we turn the lights on, please? Oh, okay. Does anybody have, if you have a question, can you stand up and face the camera so that she can see you? Anyone?
Or anything that resonated with you or that has you curious that you're going to try.
Beth, I'd like to ask you to talk a little about your multiple exposures.
Yes. I know that you attended Happiness Hour, and I did on multiple exposures, right? Yeah, I multiple exposure is my I've been playing with it for about a year now. My camera is a Canon R5, so it has in-camera multiple exposure functions. It has 4 different blend modes, and I like playing with all of them. That presentation I did for Happiness Hour sort of forced me to learn exactly what was the difference between all of them, because it's so easy in the field to just flip between them. Um, but I see them as this way to add depth and dimension to images. And yes, to abstract them, there's something in between that, I call it, I don't know if anybody else calls it this, and but non-literal. Tell what you're seeing, but it's not representative of a scene. And that's often where I find myself using those multiple exposures. Um, it gives me a chance in camera to add texture. Gone out of focus, and then I take the next exposure on top of it, like maybe going out of focus on a tree that's full of color. And so all I get are sort of mottled color in the background, and then take a straight photo of the tree. And then I get this, this textured depth kind of thing. And yes, you can do this in Photoshop. So if your camera, and I know not all cameras have the in-camera multiple exposure function, you can do it through layers in Photoshop. And actually you would have much more control in Photoshop. So that's also a great way to play with it and just see what you like. I personally love to do it because that means I'm spending more time in the field with my camera instead of behind a computer. And I just like the challenge of it. I like experimenting, and I love the surprise of it, because it's one of those things that, unlike if you're just taking, I shouldn't say just, but if you're taking a traditional single exposure literal image, there's not as many surprises as if you start doing this multiple exposure and playing with it and seeing it's basically kind of the best way to play what if I turn the camera with this way? What if I change the blend mode? What if I do, 5 exposures at once? What if I put on continuous shooting so that it's, or, like the rapid high or low repeated shooting? Do that. what will happen? What if I move the camera this way? What if I keep it still? What if I combine these two things? So to me, multiple exposure is this fantastic what if possibility, and it encourages us to play. So that's what I love about it. And so Jan, I don't know if that's maybe the path I wanted to go down, because getting into the technical of the multiple exposure is probably something that we don't have time or space for. But if anybody has been wanting to try it, hasn't tried it, I hope maybe the way I was talking about it will encourage you to do some experimentation.
Yeah, the one image was the Meyer Garden image. I thought that was a multiple exposure.
Yes, that was an in-camera. I'm just going to go back. Actually, I could probably just do it faster here. Yeah, I can go back to that. Let's see. There it is. There it is. Yeah. As is, on sort of on one of the walkways where I could see just the statue or the sculpture itself, and there were flowers down right at my at my feet. And so I thought, okay, it's the her or the she side. And so to play up the femininity side, I decided to focus on the flowers. And I experimented. I tried the grass, I tried gravel, just to play around. And really, to me, it was the flowers that told the story. And maybe if I'd been on the he or the him side, I might have. I don't know that I would have chosen flowers, but I might have. You can just kind of use your imagination. Maybe I would have said, I want to portray something more like bark, or so it gives you that chance to tell a deeper story.
Well, I guess no one else has any questions.
Okay.
So we want to thank you very, very much for
Yeah.
one program.
You're welcome. I hope that, I know that this was the start of the year, and I hope starting with something that focuses on our intentions, our mindset, our relationship to it, sort of sets the table for everything else that you might be talking about that maybe is more the traditional side of things. So I appreciate the opportunity to share this.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, I will sign off then so that you don't have to be hybrid anymore. And have a great rest of the meeting. And if anybody has any questions or wants to connect, please do reach out. And take care. Thank you. Bye.